most poignant examples for me in my career and more recent times of when I had to be decisive was on ASTRO-H. ASTRO-H was the third time trying for NASA, working with JAXA, trying to get the science. And there was a lot of pressure to get it. And it was a cost cap mission. And when I was brought on board, they had already spent quite a bit, 60% of the money, with nothing to show for it. But also, it was literally the week after the major earthquake and tsunami in Japan. So there was all kinds of pressures outside of our control and some result of things that had happened and the science pressure. And we got to one point where we were working on engineering model unit where it was clear from the testing we weren't getting the results we thought we would get to be able to get the science to cool down to what we need to cool down. And we had to decide, what are we going to do to address it? We couldn't go all the way to the beginning and start all over. We didn't have the luxury of that because programmatic issues, as well as on the Japanese side, they had to launch by a certain time. And their government wasn't going to let them just move out. Even though the earthquake and tsunami impacted them, they got some relief on that, but it wasn't like they could go past that. So we had the pressure, we couldn't just start from the beginning. We had to figure out how to go from there the best way to be able to. It wasn't a choice of we would get degraded, it was a choice of no science or we're going to get science. So the scientists on the team had a long history with the technologists that was key for this particular technology, and I'm just going to leave it at that point. And the historical context, there was a lot of opportunity for tension. There was tension, a lot of more opportunity, and it wasn't the best relationship between the two groups. They each felt they had a solution to the problem, technical solution, and at that point, the scientists, especially the PIs, the PI-led mission, came to me and said, I think we need to take over solving this, because this is a problem, this is their livelihood, and I can understand that. At the same time, the technologist was saying, this is my technology, I know how to address the problem and how we can meet this. It wasn't a problem with the technology, it was when you integrate it at the system level. Okay, so he said, I know a way to make this all work together. And it was highly emotional because of the historical context, highly emotional. Also because of where we were in time. We had already gone to headquarters many times before me and after me, asking for more money, so there was that pressure. And so the system engineering didn't know which way to go because part of the emotion, and the PI was, I'm in charge, so I'm going to make this choice. But I said, I'm the project manager, and the institutions are relying upon me to make the programmatic choice. So what I had them do is sit down together, first go off and give me an outline of their solution and the risk that were associated. And we turned the emotional discussion, we'd already had a couple, into a risk discussion. Here's the plan, here's our solution, here are the risks we've identified. And then this other group, same thing, had them each present, and then I asked a series of questions. What would happen if this goes wrong in your approach? How will we recover from that? What would it take to recover from? What would it mean? Same thing on the other side. Then we had a set of risk. We had a set of mitigation ideas, concepts for the risk. And when we were done with that, it was apparent neither one was above. You couldn't say, okay, this is the clear winner between the two. So it came down, somebody had to make a decision. And it was, if you pick the wrong decision at this point, we're starting all over. We're not going to be. And at one point, some people didn't want to make that decision because the institution will say, how did you base that? Hindsight's always 20/20, and by then you would know it was the wrong decision, but not going in. So I'm going to take, I'm the project manager, I know it's PI-led, but I talked to the PI and said, I'm going to make the decision. And I listened to the both, and then one of the things that I said, what if this happens? How will we recover? And then what if this happens? What will be the impact? And how will we recover? What would that mean? And based on that discussion, I went around and asked them, which one do you think is the right choice? I predicted, and they pretty much did, separated into the two camps. So it still was my decision at the end. And I made the decision based upon what I heard and my gut. But I didn't stop there because there was no other way. I don't have a crystal ball. So at that point, I have to use my own years of experience and my gut. I've learned to go with my gut. But I had the risk, and at that point, I said, okay, we're going this way, of course, and it was the technologist way. The scientists were upset, and I said, I had to talk with the PI. I will explain to you why. So that's a key element. Here's why I'm going with this risk. Because the technology, the one thing was the technology was made by the technologist. So he knew the ins and outs of his technology. Although the scientists understood it from a physics way and they understand the mission and everything, they did not design and create that particular technology. So they didn't know every aspect of what could and could go wrong, even though intellectually they could understand it. But the technologists, I felt, would know that better. He would have that one edge on it. So I went that way and I explained it to them. But we went one step further and I said, okay, all those things, what could happen, we now need to put a plan together in case it does happen. Because executing the plan had to be done in Japan. So it's not like we could just go around Goddard campus and go find the solution to it. We had to have a path forward. We got it all the way over there and it ended up it didn't work. That was one thing. The second thing is I said we're going to practice it so that we're going to implement it here, practice it, doing this plan, and see what we didn't, those kinds of things, like we didn't think about that, see what comes out of that and address that. And I made that decision that day. I didn't say I'm going to go think about it. Before the meeting, I told them, come with your plans, excuse me, and your risk and what you would do if those risks happen. And at the end of that meeting, I will make the decision. I can only talk from my experience. I don't know in general. I know, and even leaders a lot of times, in being decisive, there's a cultural, it depends on each culture, but it's basically the same. Working in DOD and industry and as a contractor at Goddard and now as a civil servant, I can say across those different cultures, there's a general same thing about being decisive. What does that look like? And I have found that many of them do the risk, some don't, but most of the times they do the risk, the leaders will too, and make the decision. And decisiveness is mainly viewed as being decisive if you could do it quickly and you move on, right? A lot of times it isn't, I can't say most, but a lot of times in my experience, you don't take, okay, what if what we did doesn't happen? Let's look at that right now. Usually what happens is we'll evaluate in the future and then decide then what to do. I found that it's better to look forward now. What if these risks come true? What will we do then? And see if you can get some alternative paths. And then you do that assessment. And that's one of the things, to keep checking to see, do I need to make an adjustment? One thing that I find few people do, at least in my experience, and then is explain why you chose this path versus these or this other path. That's really important in getting people to get on board. They may not like it, but at least they don't feel like you just, willy-nilly or you took favorites. One of the things that happens a lot that I've seen is that even if they set a path, or if this happens, what will we do to address it? The periodic evaluation to make sure it is going along its path. I set interim. Usually there's report back how it's going after you started. I look at what risks have arisen since you started. Have you learned something new? Did something pop out that was a surprise? Make sure that I ask those questions to make sure we're covering the bases. I think in my time, I haven't normally been asked those kinds of things if I've been on the receiving end of a decision by a project manager. Working on projects where there wasn't a decisive project manager or leader and seeing the impact it had on me to be able to get my job done, and also the frustration and angst it creates. So that was one thing. Now, how do you address that? Mentors, really good mentors. would observe, okay, what's the impact of being indecisive? What does that have on the team? And then those that were decisive, I would watch their impact. And if I thought it was a good impact, meaning they were effective, they still had the team collegiality going forward, because that's really important, right? In being decisive, the team still needs to work together as a team. And if I saw that, then those project managers and leaders, I would ask them, what are you thinking about when you're making this? How do you do that? And how do you make this happen like that? So mentoring, good mentoring, and going to classes. One other thing, making my own mistakes. I'm very introspective at work and in my personal life. And whenever I made a decision, I look at the outcome, I try to observe body and everything like that, and I can tell when I've thrown the team into chaos. I've made mistakes where I thought being decisive was the timeliness of me making a decision, and then the other aspect of it, not recanting or going back on the decision you made. So I would say another thing that I learned is I was taught being decisive means you make it and you don't look back. And there's a good element to that. You need to evaluate, did I make the wrong decision? Because unless you have a crystal ball, you may have made the wrong decision even though you were decisive. And if that's the case, you need to have enough self-awareness and self-management skills to say, I made that mistake, let's make an adjustment. And you might have to change the decision. But that's also being decisive.